Everybody,
Are you unmuted?
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me, Father Mark? Yes. Very nice to have you, and we're so very happy to have Father James Martin with us. And I want to say a big thank you to Parishioner David Trachtenberg for making this possible. Father Martin is a Jesuit priest, a best-selling author, editor-at-large of America Magazine. And he is going to be talking to us this evening about his latest book, titled Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. And we're very happy to have Polly Buxton from Buxton Books here, who has copies of this book as well as other titles by Father Martin for sale in the rear of the church. I'm going to open us with a prayer, and then I will turn it over to David for a more fulsome introduction and to enter into this program, which will begin with an overview of this new book and then some time for conversation. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for the gift of this day, the gift of this time. We thank you for the gift of Father Martin's ministry. We ask that you bless us in this Advent season. Come, O come, Emmanuel, come amongst us and renew the face of the earth. Amen.
Amen.
David.
Thank you, Adam. And you're always a hard act to follow because I have to use notes. And for all of you who know and have been to one of his sermons, you know what I'm talking about. Always very impressive. And I also want to thank all of you for coming forth to the church this evening. So I know it's past a lot of our bedtime, so I think it's amazing that we have this many parishioners here. And I want to give a very warm St. Stephen's welcome and thank you, Father James Martin, as well. You took some of my words, which is perfect. The other thing I will add is that Father Martin recently returned from Rome, where he participated as a delegate to the Synod on Synodality, and that's a mouthful, which has been described as the most important event in the church since the Second Vatican Council. And during the Q&A, Father Martin said that we can ask questions about the book, any book, and also about his time in Rome. So I have one in particular that I'm certain to ask. Father Martin has also been selected as a voice championing the cause of the Catholic LGBTQ community and bringing more attention to the community's experience within the church. As Adam said, Father James is here to talk to us this evening about his latest book, Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. But it's fair warning because his words and his books have power. They were a fundamental part of my spiritual journey from Judaism to being baptized in the Huguenot Church and then joining St. Stephen's. So if you haven't already, I urge you all to read and even reread Jesus of Pilgrimage, the book that fundamentally changed my life. So I'll now hand the mic over to Father James Martin to talk about Come Forth, and afterwards we'll have the opportunity for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. That's quite an introduction from both of you. And thank you for the kind words about my book. And thank you for welcoming me into your wonderful parish. A little bit of a apology. As you can see, this is not the most professional background. This is my bedroom. I just came from a holiday party. I was at my office. I was planning to do this from my office, but I thought I'd just come back because it's been a long day. So I actually find this less distracting than when people blank out the background. You know what I mean? You see someone's ear going in and out of the background. So anyway, tonight we're going to talk about many things, but what I want to focus on is, as David was saying, my new book, Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, which is a deep dive into the raising of Lazarus. Now, that's not the most Advent-y reading you could imagine. We read the story of Lazarus right before Easter, but I think it's really a timeless story that can speak to us at any time of the year. So for those of you who need a refresher, Jesus's friend Lazarus is sick in the town of Bethany, about a kilometer or two outside of Jerusalem. His sisters, Lazarus's sisters, Martha and Mary, who make an appearance in Luke's gospel, send word to Jesus that their brother is ill. They say, he whom you love is ill. Very interesting phrase. They don't say our brother Lazarus or your disciple Lazarus or Lazarus of Bethany. They say he whom you love. Jesus waits kind of mysteriously for a couple of days and then goes with presumably his disciples, so that's unclear, goes to Bethany. The sisters both greet him and say, Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. He asks them where the tomb is. They say, come and see, very important words in John's gospel. We're in John's gospel, chapter 11. He goes to the tomb, stands in front of it, prays, and says, Lazarus, come forth or come out, which is the actual sort of literal Greek translation, come out, and the dead man comes out. It is traditionally called Jesus's greatest miracle. So why Lazarus? When I was writing this book, I told my mom, who has a great Philadelphia way of getting to the point. She said, Lazarus, a whole book on Lazarus? How's that possible? So where did this interest in Lazarus come from? Well, when I was younger, I would bet looking around the room, there are probably people my age. Do you remember, raise your hands if you remember the miniseries Jesus of Nazareth that used to be on TV. There we go. So for those of us who are not as mature, I would say, Jesus of Nazareth was a miniseries that used to air, how times have changed, on network TV every Christmas and Easter. It premiered in 1977. It was directed by Franco Zeffirelli. And to me, the dramatic high point was the raising of Lazarus. You have Robert Powell, the English actor. By the way, you can still see all of Jesus of Nazareth, which I often say is like The Chosen in the 1970s. I mean, it had that amount of impact. You can still see it on YouTube, and you can still see the scene with Lazarus. Jesus, a guy comes up on horseback. There's no horses in the stories in John's gospel. Jesus is told that Lazarus is ill. He goes, the sisters confront him. He goes to the tomb, he stands there and he shouts out in a great British accent, because as we know, Jesus always speaks with an English accent, because he went to Oxford or Cambridge. He says, Lazarus, come forth. And he puts his arms out like this. It's very dramatic, and the music swells, and there's this long shot, and there's a tiny little shot of the tomb, and this man comes out, and it's just incredible. I get goosebumps thinking about it now. You should look it up when you go home. And it just impressed me all those years ago when I was 16, 17 years old. And I thought, who is this guy? who is this guy? And you know, we don't hear much about him before the story. We hear really nothing about him. We hear very little about him after the story. Who are these sisters who speak so bluntly to Jesus? What happens to Lazarus afterwards? So it sort of started me on a kind of lifelong quest to understand this guy and really appreciate this story. So that's when I was 16, 17. Fast forward about, 20 years. I'm in the Jesuit novitiate, and I read the story again, and it still has an impact on me, you know? Flash forward about another 20 years, and I was doing research for a book I wrote, which David talked about. Thank you very much for those kind words about Jesus, a pilgrimage. And I landed in Jerusalem with a friend of mine, another Jesuit friend. And we were staying at the Jesuit community in Jerusalem called the Pontifical Biblical Institute. And the head of the community, the superior, said, well, now that you're in the Holy Land, what would you like to see? And I said, well, you know, the Sea of Galilee, number one, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Gethsemane, you know, Bethlehem, Nazareth. And he said, well, what about the tomb of Lazarus? I said, what? They know where that is? He said, of course, it's in, now, interestingly, it's in a town called Al-Azariah. Can you hear that? Can you hear it? The place of Lazarus, Al-Azariah. That's what they call it now. That's what they call Bethany. So I went into the tomb. There's pictures in this book, which I'm very happy about. You can see going down into the tomb. There was no one else in the tomb at that day. And like a good Jesuit, I thought, well, what am I going to think about? What am I going to pray about? And I thought about, well, what kinds of things would I like to leave behind in the tomb? You know what I mean? Like, what kinds of things would I like to let go of? Would I like to let die? Would I like to just sort of cast off? And it was a very powerful moment for me. I think because I love the story so much, and I actually don't put this in the book because I never imagined that I'd be able to be in this space. And, archaeologists and church historians say that this is most likely the space. It is a first century tomb in Bethany that has been venerated since the earliest days of the church, right? As Lazarus's tomb. And I found it very powerful and sort of imagining myself coming forth into the sunshine and having God kind of call me forth. I think all of us have ideas of, the person we'd like to be, right? The things that we'd like to let go of. Maybe I'd like to be less judgmental or less angry. I'm sure everybody in the church can fill in a blank. I would like to be less, fill in the blank, less doubting, less angry, less bitter, less sarcastic, less lazy, whatever, that we'd like to leave behind. And I just found it a really powerful meditation. And then a couple of years later, I started leading pilgrimages to the Holy Land through American Media, where I work here in New York. And we went to Lazarus's tomb, even though it's in Palestinian territory. Now, we haven't gone for the last, 2 years back to the Holy Land for obvious reasons. And it's not a place that a lot of pilgrims go to. So we went, and the first time I went with a group of pilgrims, about 40, 50 pilgrims, I thought, well, this particular meditation was important to me, so maybe I can, kind of should suggest it to them, because as you know, not everything that affects you affects another person. Do you know what I mean? That same way. So I said, well, I'd invite you to just sort of imagine the things you would like to let go of, let die, and imagine God calling you forth. And I was really shocked that the number of people that came out sort of crying or emotional. And I thought, well, all right, wow. And then at night at faith sharing with everyone, people mentioned that as a really important moment for them. So I thought, you know what? I think it's time to write a book about this. So the book is a combination of biblical exegesis, so looking at each of the parts of the story to try to understand what we can, what New Testament scholars tell us about the story. A little bit of spirituality. So what does the story mean for us today? So, that overarching theme of what do we need to leave behind in our tombs, right? Third, travelogue, right? So what is it like today in Bethany? What is the tomb like? What is it like to be there? What is the history of that location? And then finally, a little bit of a cultural history of Lazarus. Lazarus in fine arts, in poetry, he's all over the place. In fiction, in movies. By the way, as an aside, one of the things that I found fascinating was in a lot of fictional versions of the story of Lazarus, and like I said, he's been in a lot. Lazarus is angry about coming back. Why didn't you leave me where I was? He was in heaven or wherever, and he has to come back in this kind of human body. So that's kind of what the book is. But just a little bit about Lazarus, and to start us off with the discussion. The first question we have to ask is, did Lazarus exist? Right? Did he even exist? Is this a story that's kind of made up? A number of scholars say, well, maybe this was just something that the Gospel of John made up. But there's a very interesting insight from New Testament scholars, which is that if we know, for example, that most of the miracles in Jesus's public ministry the recipients of the miracles or the participants don't have names, right? So as you know, Jesus heals a leper, or Jesus heals the woman with the hemorrhage, or Jesus meets a Samaritan woman. Or a blind man, or a beggar, right? So they're not named. And that's most likely because, as you know, there's sort of 3 stages in the development of the Gospels. The first stage is the actual happening, the events, the public ministry. Second stage is in the next, say, 30 years, oral histories. So people are telling these stories orally It's an oral culture, but also they expected Jesus to return again soon. When it became obvious that that wasn't happening, they started writing it. That's the third stage. So most likely the reason that we don't know these people's names or that they're not included in the Gospels is because the early church didn't know their names. It might have been a woman with a hemorrhage who comes out, touches Jesus's cloak, is healed, and then goes back into the crowd, right? We don't know who she is. But New Testament scholars say that when we know the names of people outside of the 12, right, the apostles and people like Mary Magdalene, it means that the church, the early church, retained memories of them, of these individuals. So people like who? Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, Joanna, right? Martha and Mary, and Lazarus. So this is one way that historians look at whether or not this story is historical. The other question that people have raised is, well, why isn't this story in the other Gospels? Did you ever think about that? This is traditionally called Jesus's greatest miracle, right? I mean, it's tremendous, right? Raising someone from the dead. It's funny, a reporter said to me, well, who gets to say what Jesus's greatest miracle is? I said, well, it's not like it's a contest, right? It's just, and it's not my appellation. It's traditionally called his greatest miracle. So why is this greatest miracle not in the other Gospels? It's not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It seems kind of strange. And when I was young, I used to think that was a sign that maybe it wasn't real. But New Testament scholars remind us that the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so-called because you can see them with one eye, the stories are very similar. Mark comes first in AD 65, and then Matthew a little, maybe about AD 80, and Luke about AD 85, right? They're kind of similar, and they parallel one another. Those Gospels were really focused on Jesus's ministry in Galilee, up north, right? Around the Sea of Galilee. John's Gospel is a little more concerned with Jesus's ministry in the south, in Judea, right? Around Jerusalem. And in Mark's and in the Synoptic Gospels, you probably know, there already are stories of Jesus raising people from the dead, right? So the two stories, whenever you hear about Jesus raising people from the dead, you think, well, Lazarus. But also, there's the son of the widow of Nain, remember her? Right, where she's bringing her son out on in a funeral procession, and Jesus touches the bier or the body, and he rises from the dead. And also Jairus's daughter, right? Jairus's daughter, little girl, I say to you, arise. So New Testament scholars say that the Synoptic Gospels didn't need another raising from the dead story, and as the New Testament scholar John Myers said, they may not have known the great theological masterpiece that later would come into John's Gospel. They may have known traditions of that, but they didn't need another story of Jesus raising someone from the dead. But there's a really interesting connection. In Luke's Gospel, do you remember the story of so-called Lazarus and Dives? Remember that story? So Lazarus and the rich man. Remember the story about the rich man and the poor man is sitting outside his door covered with sores. The dogs would come to lick him. Remember? And he died, and the poor man goes to the afterlife, and the rich man goes to the afterlife, and the rich man is told, well, you know, you're in agony, but the poor man, Lazarus, is doing okay. And the rich man, this is compressing it a bit, the rich man says, well, send Lazarus back to warn my brothers. And Abraham says, well, even if we send someone back from the dead, people won't believe him. Now, the story is usually used as a kind of foreshadowing of Jesus, right? Even if someone comes back from the dead. But it's interesting that New Testament scholars remind us that it's the only parable. If you think about it, this is the only parable where a person has a name. You know, like a man had two sons, or a woman sweeping the house, or the Good Samaritan. They're not named. It's not like a man had two sons, you know, Bob and Joe, right? It's just a man had two sons. But in this story, Lazarus and Dives, Lazarus is named. And it is a story about a man coming back from the dead. Isn't that interesting? It's a parable about a man coming back from the dead, named Lazarus. So today, scholars say that Luke probably knew about the tradition in John's community. We have to think about them writing for different communities about Lazarus. So all these things sort of remind us and solidify our certainty that Lazarus was an historical figure. This is a story that goes back to the time of Jesus. Now, recently, to draw on some wonderful Protestant scholarship, there's also been the identification of Lazarus with the beloved disciple. This was kind of the most in the book for me. So raise your hands if you've heard of the beloved disciple. Raise your hands a little bit. Okay, so maybe most of you, but some of you maybe not. So the beloved disciple is, oh, I think you froze a little bit. Can you guys still hear me okay? Can you?
Yeah.
So the beloved, yeah, okay, good. So the beloved disciple is an important figure in John's gospel and is the source of many of the stories. And for the longest time, people wondered who the beloved disciple is. A lot of people thought it's John himself. Some people thought it's the Apostle Thomas. Some people thought it might be John, the son of Zebedee. But increasingly, and thanks to the scholarship of, I'm sure you've heard of Ben Witherington III, a wonderful Protestant scripture scholar, people think that it might be Lazarus. People think the beloved disciple, actually this mysterious beloved disciple, might be Lazarus. Now, why do we think that? Well, there's lots of reasons. First of all, Lazarus makes his appearance. The story of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus, is in John 11. The beloved disciple doesn't show up before that. So in all of John's gospel, it is as if the story of Lazarus is the introduction to the beloved disciple. Second of all, Lazarus is called he whom you love. Remember I said that earlier when the sisters send the word to Jesus. It's he whom you love. But there's lots of internal proofs that I talk about in the book. One of the most interesting ones is in John 21, at the end of John, when the risen Christ appears to Peter. Remember that story where they see him grilling fish? Do you remember that by the seashore? And the beloved disciple and Peter are in the boat, and the beloved disciple says, "It is the Lord." And they both jump in the water. They go up to the risen Christ, and Peter and he have that dialogue, right? Do you love me? Do you love me? Feed my sheep. At the end of the dialogue, Peter says, well, what about him? Pointing to the beloved disciple, which is a very strange thing. The risen Christ is in front of you. You'd think you'd be a little less concerned with, like, what about this guy? And Jesus said, well, what is it to you if he should remain until I come? And John's gospel says, because of that, the rumor arose that this disciple would never die. Now, that makes no sense about anyone other than Lazarus. So there's all these kind of internal proofs that point to the fact that he may be the source of a lot of the stories in John's gospel. And there's some beautiful parallels between the story of the raising of Lazarus and Jesus's life in John's gospel, which I love. One of them is on Easter Sunday, Jesus comes out of the tomb, right? And the beloved disciple and the other two disciples look in the tomb, and what do they see? They see the grave clothes rolled up, right? The grave clothes and the head covering. When Lazarus comes out at the end of the story of Lazarus, he's bound hand and foot in his grave clothes. Now, why the difference? Jesus is not going to need his anymore. Isn't that interesting? Lazarus will. Jesus is not going to need his grave clothes anymore. He's risen from the dead definitively. Lazarus, of course, will die again. So there's all these kind of beautiful parallels, but I don't want to belabor the point too much. The book talks a lot about the possibility of Lazarus as the beloved disciple. But Lazarus is not the only person in this story. The two people I want to spend a little bit of time with before we go into questions and answers are Martha and Mary and their characters. Now, Martha and Mary, the two sisters who are grieving the loss of their brother Lazarus, they greet Jesus in Bethany, and they both say the same thing. Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. It's very blunt. All right. Now, a lot of people say that this is their profession of faith in him, but it's also a kind of reproach. They're being very honest. And their characters mirror the way that they are presented in Luke's gospel, right? In Luke's gospel, do you remember the story of Jesus visiting Martha and Mary's house in Bethany? Do you remember that story? So Martha is working and Mary is sitting by Jesus's feet. And Martha says some of the most remarkable things that anyone's ever said to Jesus in the Gospels. Don't you care that I'm doing all the work? I mean, it's something to say to Jesus. Quote, tell her then to help me. I mean, that's really blunt. By the way, there's an interesting, I put this in the book, the New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine, who you probably know, she's a Jewish New Testament scholar. When I was writing this book, I sent it to 4 or 5 real John scholars, and she was one of them. And I wrote about Jesus going to Martha and Mary's house for a meal. And Amy Jill said, there's no meal in that story. I said, of course there's a meal in that story. I've seen the pictures, right? Seen all the paintings. And when you look more carefully, Martha says, don't you care that she's not helping me with what? My diaconia, my ministry, my service. And this is especially important in the Catholic Church today, where we're thinking about women deacons, or at least there's been discussion about them. And Amy Jill said one of the reasons that we have, in a sense, consigned Martha to, as she said, peeling potatoes, is because probably the early church was uncomfortable with the sort of linking of Martha with diaconia. Whence the word deacon? It really means ministry or service. So Martha is very able to speak to Jesus very bluntly in the story in Luke, right? It's kind of the same in John's gospel, the story of Lazarus. Martha comes out, she's the first one, she's the active one. She comes out, she meets Jesus. She said, Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. Mary is staying back home, right? She is the contemplative one. Martha goes back to alert her, says the master is here. Mary comes out, and what does she do? She kneels at his feet, just like in Luke's gospel. Isn't that interesting? So clearly, even just in these stories, the church retains these very powerful memories of these 2 strong women. And I think these stories, particularly Martha's honesty, really has something to teach us. How can Martha be honest with Jesus? How can she say those things to him? How can she say, don't you care? I'm doing all the work. Tell her to help me. Well, it's someone, you only talk like that to someone you know well. Do you know what I mean? When I went to the synod, as David was saying, I spent the month of October in Rome at the synod. People would say to me, truly, people would say, you have to tell Pope Francis this. And I said, yeah, I don't talk to Pope Francis like that. Now, I might talk to someone I work with or a friend like that, but who do we speak to? Whom do we speak with like that? People we know, people we're familiar with, people that we're intimate with. So it shows how honest and how the honesty of Martha shows how close she was to Jesus, right? And it's an invitation, I think, for us to be honest with God in prayer, because the more honest you are, right, the more revelatory you are, the more yourself you are, the more you're able to grow closer to God, and God is able to grow closer to you. So I think they have a lot to tell us just in that story, just in that honesty. I think it's a really wonderful invitation to honesty. So I don't want to talk too long. It's already 8 o'clock. That's a little bit about some of what the book is about. That's just the first few chapters. A little bit about the historicity of Lazarus, how we know Lazarus might be the beloved disciple, and then a little bit about Martha and Mary. But the overarching theme of the book is really how the story of Lazarus enables us to hear God asking us, inviting us to leave behind in the tomb whatever we think might want to die, right? Whether it's a grudge or a resentment or bitterness or disappointment, right? Or some personality trait, anger or sarcasm or laziness, and hear God calling us into new life, and hear God calling us to come forth and live new life. So anyway, a little bit of a précis. Now I much prefer answering your questions than hearing myself talk. So happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. So can you hear me without the mic, or do you want me to put the mic on? You can,
No, I can hear you without the mic.
great. So I'm gonna, since I have the floor, I'm gonna ask the first question. I'll get you guys warmed up here. So the first question is, you actually alluded to the silence or the relative silence of Lazarus in the other gospels, but there's actual silence from Lazarus in in the story itself. Like, he doesn't say anything during the story. Now, granted, he's dead for much of the gospel, but even after he comes forth, there's silence. And I was just wondering, is there a message in that for us?
Yeah, one of the theories, it's a bit of a, so there's lots of questions about who Lazarus was and who the sisters were. I talk about this in the book. They live in Bethania, and one of the translations, there's multiple translations of Beth, city of, Bethlehem means, city of peace. Excuse me, that's Jerusalem, sorry. Anyway, Beth means city or house of bread, house of figs, house of dates. Some scholars say it might have been house of affliction. And in some Dead Sea Scrolls, there are 3 towns mentioned outside of the temple precincts, or far enough outside the temple precincts, where sick people would stay. And later on in the gospel, there's a little bit of a connection with Simon, quote, Simon the leper. That's what he's called in the gospels. So there's some thought that Lazarus and his sisters perhaps may have been victims of leprosy. Now, why am I mentioning this? There's also a theory that, now, women could own property back then. But in Luke's gospel, it is called the house of Martha. It's not the house of Lazarus. So why are all 3 of these people unmarried and living in Martha's house? One theory, it's a theory, is that Lazarus may have been in some way disabled and maybe unable to speak, right? It's a theory, right? It certainly adds a little bit of depth to the idea that this is he whom you love. Do you know what I mean? This disabled person who Jesus really loved. The other thing, I think maybe the more mainstream explanation is, in John's gospel, the focus is, as in all the other gospels, it's on Jesus, right? And so, sometimes we hear the crowd is amazed that we've never seen anything like this. But more often than not, the person who's the recipient of the miracle just says nothing, right? You usually hear about the response of the crowd. We would love to know what Lazarus thought, but I think the way John writes it is it's to focus on the person of Jesus. The purpose of John's gospel and all the signs in John's gospel, the Semea. So in the John's gospel, it's Semea. In the Synoptic Gospels, it's works of power. They're both miracles, is so that we can come to believe. So in a sense, David, I think that John would say, I mean, this is not what I would say. I would want to hear what he had to say. John would say, it doesn't matter what Lazarus says. You know what I mean? What matters is Jesus. And then you focus on Jesus, and then it might enable you to come to believe. So yeah, that's a couple ways of looking at why he's silent. And he really is. Now in the fictional versions, he's not silent. He's disappointed that he's back. In one of them, it's quite beautiful. There's 2 books that I look at in particular. One's called The Gospel According to Lazarus, that kind of recreates his story and his life. It's fictional. The other is called Lazarus is Dead. And in one of them, I think the Gospel of Lazarus, Jesus says, I'm sorry I'm late. Because, he waits those 4 days. And Lazarus says, it's quite touching. Late for what? Sort of like still waking up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question, though.
Other questions? And I may have to repeat it if you can't hear.
Sure. Thank you.
Father Martin, I'm curious if the experience of writing this book about Lazarus was at all transformation for you, and if so, in what way?
I heard that question. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great. I've not been asked that. I think the story has always meant, I would say, the same to me, which is this idea of, I mean, as an adult, I think as a kid, it was more just exciting that Jesus could raise someone from the dead, like almost like a magician. But, you know, in the last 5 or 10 years, it's been more about, as I said earlier, just this idea of letting go, letting go. I think what was transformative for me was recognizing just how each part of the story holds meaning for us. It's not just, oh, you know, Jesus says, come forth, and he comes forth. Each part of the story, you know, the beginning where he's called he whom you love, which I just find so mysterious. The fact that Jesus waits for 3 days, right, before he goes, very mysterious. What the sisters say, the sisters saying, come and see. Jesus praying by the tomb. Jesus saying, I mean, as an example, take away the stone and untie him. Now, I guess what I'm saying is the story is not simply the story of Jesus's power to raise someone from the dead. Each part of the story, which is what I try to do in each chapter, is meaningful to us. Let's just take an example. So the two things I just mentioned, two things that Jesus says to the crowd, take away the stone, right? And untie him and let him go. Now, why is he saying that? I mean, even take away the stone. Lazarus could have just appeared. Lazarus come forth, and there's Lazarus. Lazarus disappears. Untie him and let him go. First of all, why doesn't Jesus do that? And second of all, Lazarus could have come out naked. Jesus doesn't have his grave clothes on when he's resurrected from the dead. So my sense is that Jesus is inviting the crowd to participate in the freeing of Lazarus. And I often use this as a sort of spiritual invitation for all of us. We are called to help free other people. What are the stones in other people's lives that we need to take away in order that they might experience God's love, right? What are the grave cloths and head covering that we have to help remove from people in order to help them be free, right? So I think that those particular lines of Jesus as a kind of invitation or it's a command to the crowd, take away the stone, it's a command, take away the stone and untie him, can say something to us. So to answer your question, I think the transformation for me was to see it as more than simply a miracle, and instead as a story whose each part has something to say to us. And that was a different way of looking at it than when I was a boy.
Other questions?
Father Martin, the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels, particularly a gospel like Mark, is very human. But the Jesus of John's Gospel, the latest written of the 4 canonical Gospels, comes across most often as very divine. But what's interesting about the Lazarus story is here you have this great miracle, and yet embedded in that story is this very human, poignant moment of Jesus weeping. And I wonder if you could talk about the significance of that moment for you in that particular story.
Yeah, I will say that's a great insight. One of the sort of funny frustrations of having written a book and doing parish talks is that I hear insights like that about the human Jesus doing something that's sort of divine and thinking, oh, I should have put that in the book. So it's a great insight. I frankly never thought of it quite that way, but you're right. He does something very human, which is to weep. Yeah, you know, as you said, in Mark's gospel, he's very human, or at least it feels, I mean, he's human and divine, but it feels like there's an emphasis more on his humanity. He says to a woman, you know, it's not right that we should take the table scraps and feed them to the dogs. He can be impatient. He's in a rush. He's very human. And certainly in John's gospel, as one New Testament scholar said, it is almost as if through the whole gospel, he's the risen one. Right? He's the resurrected one. As an aside, which is where I thought you might be going with this question, but as an aside, the scholars who believe that Lazarus is the beloved disciple say that that identification could actually help explain what we would call the Christology of that gospel. So how Christ is presented. In other words, if you've been raised from the dead by somebody, you're going to have a pretty high Christology, right? You're going to present him in all the stories as already, in a sense, the Son of God. It's not something that has to be kind of discerned or divined, to coin a phrase. But that image of Jesus crying is really quite powerful. And you're right, it is a very human response. And it's funny, I'm just realizing this. It is, in a sense, at odds with the rest of the story where Jesus is always in command in John's gospel. I really wish I'd put this in the chapter, maybe addition. But you're right, it's at odds with Jesus in the rest of the story, who's kind of in command. I will go when I go to see him, I'll go when I go. Take away the stone, do this. But interestingly, as I point out in the book, the Greek words, I'm not a Greek scholar, but it's always good to go back to the original Greek in which the gospel was written. The gospels are all written in Greek. The Greek words that are used around that moment, Jesus greatly disturbed and moved in spirit, are actually words that are used more about anger in other parts of the gospel, which is really interesting. There's a word, I can't pronounce it in Greek, and it's basically used to describe what a horse does when it snorts, like he's angry. And all the other places in the gospel where this is used, Jesus is frustrated. Now, why would he be frustrated or angry? Well, one might be just at the sort of experience of death. Another might be, at some people say, at the disbelief of the crowds. Another sort of deeply moved or frustrated or agitated is that he probably knows that raising Lazarus will set in motion his own death.
Wow.
In fact, in John's gospel, the precipitating factor for the crucifixion is Lazarus, right? In the synoptics, it's the cleansing of the temple, right? But if you think about it, the reception that Jesus gets on Palm Sunday makes more sense if he has raised someone from the dead. So it seems likely that this led to his crucifixion. Why am I bringing that up? Because if Jesus somehow intuits that this is going to get him into trouble, there's a lot of frustration or angst, right? So he could have been crying because he sees Martha and Mary crying because his friend is dead, but he also could have been crying because of this sort of really deeply perturbed feeling at the presence of death, at what he was going to have to do, and also what it would mean when he did that thing, right? So, but you're right, that's a really great insight. I really wish I put that in the story. He is very human in the midst of this story that focuses more on his divinity. Yeah.
Then,
Father Martin, thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. Clearly, the gospel skeptics like Jefferson and Tolstoy who think the gospels work better without miracles. What do you think?
Yeah, well, a number of scholars will say that some of the things that we take for granted in terms of the sayings, and that, Jefferson, as you know, literally cut out the miracles and the resurrection, and you can buy Jefferson's Bible, that some of the things that we actually more easily ascribe to Jesus have less sort of historical attestation than the miracles do, right? And the miracles, I think, make us very uncomfortable. They certainly made Thomas Jefferson uncomfortable because, they speak of a supernatural world. But you take the miracles out of Jesus's life, and it means that a lot of the sayings don't make sense. It means a lot of the stories don't make sense. But I would also say, whenever I hear that question, when John the Baptist's disciples, when John the Baptist is in jail, remember, he sends word to Jesus. And John the Baptist's disciples say to Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we wait for another?" Remember that? We usually read that around Lent. And what does Jesus say? Jesus does not say, "Yes, I am." or no, I'm not. Jesus says, go and tell John what you see. The lame walk, the deaf hear, the blind see, right? The dead are raised, and the poor of the good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who takes no offense. In other words, Jesus is saying in this saying that I am raising people from the dead and I'm doing miracles. So this is something that Jesus himself said. I think when we cut out the Gospels, when we cut out well, there's a Freudian slip. When we cut out the miracles, we're really cutting out the Gospels. And we are making a Jesus in our own image. So Jefferson didn't like the fact that he had to grapple with miracles and the resurrection. Well, that's not the Jesus in the Gospels, and that's not the way Jesus is presented to us. And so you're making God in your own image. I think, it's about the humanity and the divinity of Jesus. Most of us today are more uncomfortable with the divinity, like the signs of the miracles and the resurrection, and I'm the Son of God and all that, and he's the second person of the Trinity. We like him as a sage, right? The Beatitudes and all that. Some people actually find the humanity difficult, that Jesus would get angry, that Jesus would cry. That's in Catholic circles, that's that Jesus would learn. In Catholic circles, that's really difficult for some people. I don't want to hear about Jesus or Mary and his family wanting to restrain him in Mark chapter 3. They think he's out of his mind. People don't want to hear that. What are you talking about? That Mary thought that Jesus was out of his mind and went with the rest of his family to arrest him? I don't want to hear that. Where is that? So it's the human Jesus and his family. But I think if you take one or the other out, it's not Jesus. Scissor out his divinity and his humanity, and it's a Jesus of your own making. So yeah, so I think we have to really grapple with the miracles. Yeah, and the resurrection. So yeah, so God bless Thomas Jefferson and Tolstoy, but I think they missed the boat on that.
Can I ask a silly question? I don't know whether I'm remembering this from reading John or from watching the TV program. But it seems to me that Mary said something about Lazarus stinking.
Yes.
And I want to know what's the value of that little piece, except I like that story. No, it wasn't Mary that said it, was Martha, I believe, that said it.
Absolutely.
It makes her human.
No, absolutely. And well, there's a couple, I talk about that in the book. One of the great translations that I include, I think it's the King James Version. It's Lord, he stinketh. Lord, he stinketh. So a couple of things. Number one, and by the way, in a lot of the portrayals, I think see if I can find it. I think I have one here. Hold on. You will in the traditional portrayals of Lazarus, I'll show you. Just give me a second. In all the portrayals of Lazarus, I'm sure you can see this. Okay, there's Lazarus.
Yeah.
You see the guy holding up a cloth to his face? There's always someone, he's right next to the tomb.
Yeah.
There's always someone, always, on the cover of the book. See the guy in green?
Oh, yeah.
Now, why is that? I mean, that's a very astute question. Well, first of all, it's to remind people he's dead.
Right.
In the story of the widow of Nain's son, he's still on the funeral bier, right? He's not buried yet. In the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter, she's just died. He's in the tomb. He's dead. And I think it's a way to convey to the reader, this is more than waking him up or healing him from an illness, he's dead. And Jesus, in fact, says in John, Lazarus is dead. I mean, it's really powerful. So the stench, I think, is in terms of the writing, it's a reminder of what we're dealing with. But another thing, which it's because it's a very good question you asked, is that Martha, and I say this in the book, Martha is very concerned with the practical, which I love. She's not helping me with my work. Where were you? It's going to stink. It's just a great human, practical, realistic person speaking, right? Which I love. But the other thing which I really like, and a lot of scholars have talked about this, and in the paperback version of my book, Pope Francis wrote an introduction. I was very happy about that. He talked about the sort of stench in our lives. And in my own writing, I say that Jesus is not afraid to go into the parts of us that are kind of stinky. You know what I mean? Like we all have parts of us that maybe aren't dead, right? But are kind of rotten and smelly. And so, and Jesus is not afraid, which I love. There's going to be a stench. That's okay. Take away the stone, which is quite powerful. So I actually really love that the line that you're highlighting. It seems like a strange throwaway line, but it's actually quite profound. He's dead. She's being blunt, and Jesus is not afraid of the stench in our lives. He's not afraid of that. Let me in. Take away the stone. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Father Martin, I may not be remembering this correctly, but I thought that there was something that implied that maybe Jesus tarried on purpose so that he can have more of a miracle.
That's correct. So Jesus waits. One of the chapters of my book is why does Jesus wait? And it said, accordingly, even though he loved Martha and Mary, he stayed where he was for 2 days. Now it's the strangest thing. And there's a couple explanations. So you're right. He waits. In fact, let's see if I can read it. Hold on. So Lazarus is in the tomb 4 days. Here we go. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Now, why is that? All right, so a couple explanations. The first explanation is that Jesus was going to give Lazarus something better than healing. So Lazarus is ill. He's going to give him something better. He's going to wait and give him life. The second explanation is that, as your pastor was saying, in John's gospel, Jesus is always in control. And I'll go when I go. You know what I mean? No one tells me, you're going to go. I'll go when I go. I'm in control. I'm in control. And I'll go when I go. But probably the most accurate explanation is that at the time, according to a lot of scholars, the Jewish belief was that the soul hovered around the body for 3 days. And so if he had come earlier, people would have said, well, he wasn't really dead. So I think there's a sense that Jesus waits in order to, in a sense, demonstrate his power over death. So or a combination of all three of those explanations. But it's quite mysterious, and it does need to be looked at, because it almost looks like he's being callous, right? Like he just makes his friend die and his sister suffer. But I think the most likely explanation is the last explanation, that he wanted to wait till it was clear. As he says in the earlier, Lazarus is dead. He's dead. And he says to Thomas, for your sake, I'm glad I was not there. It's a very divine Jesus, right? I'm going to do this great thing. Just wait. Maybe one more question?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I have one.
So Father Martin, you've just come back from Rome. You were at the synod. I'm an Episcopal priest, you're a Catholic priest. We might answer this question differently, but I wonder if you could reflect on what you think this gospel story is saying to the church today.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll tell you a funny story. So I was at the synod, in case you aren't familiar with it, it was a multi-year gathering of people from all around the world where we sought input from parishes and dioceses from all over the world. We met last year, 350 delegates, chosen in different ways. And then this year, and then we finally put out a document that is inviting the church to be more listening, more participatory, and more inclusive, basically. That's what we're trying to do. And I'll tell you a funny story. By way of answering your question, which is a very good question, we were all able at some point to speak to the entire synod body. You may have seen the pictures of, I'm sure over the last 2 years, you've seen the pictures of people sitting in the great hall around the round tables, which is a really different way for people to make decisions in the Catholic Church, because it's all kind of top down. But we were sitting in round tables talking to cardinals and bishops and priests and lay people and people in religious orders, or as they called us, non-bishops. That's what they called us. And so we were allowed to speak to the whole crowd on video. Everybody had a little video monitor at their screen. And I said, at some point at my table, I said, the story, this is answering your question, says a lot to the church because it asks the church what needs to die. What in the church, what practices or old ways of being or old ways of looking at things needs to die, and can we see God calling the church, all of the churches, the Christian church, right, more broadly into new life? So that's the answer to the question. Now, here's the funny story. Someone said to me, you know what you should say to everybody here? It's all these 350 people from all over the world, cardinals and archbishops and bishops, and you should say, the synod reminds me that the church is called to let things die, something like Lazarus, was being called to let things die and walk out into new life. The topic of my book, Come Forth, the promise of Jesus. So someone said, I dare you to do an ad for your book. But really, it's something that is applicable to all of us individually, right? And to sort of wrap up, even during Lent, the story of Lazarus has something to say to us. Lent is a time of, even during Advent, it has something to say to us. Advent is a time of expecting Jesus in a new way, a time of conversion and metanoia and letting things go, right? And preparing ourselves, prepare the way of the Lord, right? That's the beginning of the story, and Lazarus is towards the end. But it really is this invitation to conversion and to leaving things behind. So I think that's on an individual level and on a corporate level, I would say an ecclesial level as a church too. Let me just say thank you. It's been really fun. These have been great questions. And it's wonderful to see everybody so close up. I feel like I'm with you. Thank you for allowing me to do this virtually. You just saved me 3 days of travel, so I appreciate that. And I just want to encourage you to read the book and keep me in your prayers, and hopefully we'll see each other in person soon. So thank you.
We'll let you get back to your party if we're gonna go, or go to bed, so.
I'm not going back to that party. I'm staying here.
It was great seeing you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. God bless you. And thanks for setting it up, David.